William Somerset Maugham is a distinguished British author. He was born in Paris and his childhood was spent in a French speaking society. After the death of his father, he returned to England at the age of 10. He studied at Heidelberg and at St. Thomas Hospital, London, and qualified as a doctor. But he preferred writing to practicing medicine. During his long career as a writer, Mom produced a large number of novels, plays, and short stories. Some of his best novels include Of Human Bondage, The Moon, and Sixpence, and Cakes and Ale. Has an amazing skill of revealing with a few touches a situation and the essentials of a character, and his stories are told with a ludicity and an economy of words which are the mark of a supreme craftsman. And one such story was The Ant and the Grasshopper. When I was a very small boy, I was made to learn by heart certain of the fables of La Fontaine, and the moral of each was carefully explained to me. Among those I learnt was The Ant and the Grasshopper, which is devised to bring home to the young a useful lesson that in an imperfect world industry is rewarded and giddiness punished. In this admirable fable, I apologize for telling something which everyone is politely but inexactly supposed to know, that the ant spent a laborious summer gathering its winter store, while the grasshopper sits on a blade of grass singing to the sun. Winter comes and the ant is comfortably provided for, but the grasshopper has an empty ladder. He goes to the ant and begs for a little food. Then the ant gives him her classic answer. What were you doing in the summer time? Saving your presence, I sang. I sang all day, all night. You sang. Why? Then go and dance. I do not ascribe it to perversity on my part, but rather to the inconsequence of childhood, which is deficient in moral sense, that I could not quite reconcile myself to the lesson. My sympathies were with the grasshopper, and for some time I never saw an ant without putting my foot on it. In this summary, and as I have discovered since, entirely human, fashion, I sought to express my disapproval of prudence and common sense. I could not help thinking of this fable when the other day I saw George Ramsay lunching by himself in a restaurant. I never saw anyone wear an expression of such deep gloom. He was staring into the space. He looked as though the burden of the whole world sat on his shoulders. I was sorry for him. I suspected at once that his unfortunate brother had been causing trouble again. I went up to him and held out my hand. How are you? I asked. I'm not in hilarious spirits, he answered. Is it Tom again? He said. Yes, it is Tom again. Why don't you chuck him? You have done everything in the world for him. You must know by now that he's quite hopeless. I suppose every family has a black sheep. Tom had been a sore trial for 20 years. He had begun his life decently enough. He went into business, married, and had two children. The Ramsays were perfectly respectable people, and there was every reason to suppose that Tom Ramsay would have a useful and honorable career. But one day, without warning, he announced that he did not like work and that he wasn't suited for marriage. He wanted to enjoy life. He would not listen to any expulsions. He left his wife and his office. He had little money and he spent 2 happy years in various capitals of Europe. Rumors of his doing reached his relations from time to time and they were profoundly shocked. He certainly had a very good time. They shook their heads and asked what would happen when his money was spent. They soon found out. He borrowed. He was charming and unscrupulous. I have never met anyone to whom it was more difficult to refuse a loan. He made a steady income from his friends and he made friends easily. But he always said that money you spent on the necessity was boring. The money that was amusing to spend was the money you spent on luxuries. For this, he depended on his brother George. He did not waste his charm on him. George was a serious man and insensible to such enticements. George was respectable. Once or twice he fell to Tom's promises of amendment and gave him considerable sum in order that he might make a fresh start. On these, Tom bought a motor car and some very nice jewelry. But when circumstances forced George to realize that his brother would not settle down and he washed his hands off him, Tom, without a qualm, began to blackmail him. It was not very nice for a respectable lawyer to find his brother shaking cocktails behind the bar of his favorite restaurant or to see him waiting on the box seat of a taxi outside his club. Tom said that to serve in a bar or to drive a taxi was perfectly decent occupation. But if George could oblige him with a couple of £100, he didn't mind for the honor of the family giving it up. And George paid. Once, Tom nearly went to prison. George was terribly upset. He went into the whole discreditable affair. Really, Tom had gone too far. He had been wild, thoughtless, and selfish, but he had never done before anything dishonest by which George meant illegal. And if he were to be prosecuted, he would assuredly be convicted. But you cannot allow your only brother to go to the goal. The man Tom had cheated, a man called Cronshaw, was vindictive. He was determined to take the matter into the courts. He said Tom was a scoundrel and should be punished. It cost George an infinite deal of trouble and £500 to settle the affair. I've never seen him in such a rage when he heard that Tom and Cronshaw had gone off together to Monte Carlo the moment they encashed the check. They spent happy months there. For 20 years, Tom raced and gambled, philandered with prettiest girls, danced, ate in the most expensive restaurants, and dressed beautifully. He always looked as if he had just stepped out of a bandbox. Though he was 46, you could never have taken him for more than 35. He was the most amusing companion, and though you knew he was perfectly worthless, you could not but enjoy his society. He had high spirits, an unfailing gaiety, and an incredible charm. I never grudged the contributions he regularly levied on me for the necessities of his existence. I never lent him £50 without feeling that I was in his debt. Tom Ramsay knew everyone, and everyone knew Tom Ramsay. You could not approve of him, but you could not help liking him. Poor George, only a year older than his scapegrace brother, looked 60. He had never taken more than a fortnight's holiday in a year for a quarter of a century. He was in his office every morning at 9:30 and he never left till 6. He was honest, industrious, and worthy. He had a good wife to whom he had never been unfaithful even in thought, and 4 daughters to whom he was the best of fathers. He made a point of saving a third of his income, and his plan was to retire at 55 to a little house in the country where he proposed to cultivate his garden and play golf. His life was blameless. He was glad that he was growing old because Tom was growing old. He rubbed his hands and said, "It's all very well when Tom was young and good looking, but he's only a year younger than I am. In 4 years, he'll be 50. He won't find life so easy then. I shall have £30,000 by the time I'm 50. For 25 years, I have said that Tom would end in the gutter, and we shall see how he likes that. Well, we shall see if it really pays best to work or to be idle. Poor George. I sympathized with him. I wondered now, as I sat down beside him, what infamous thing Tom had done. George was evidently very much upset. Do you know what's happened now? He asked me. I was prepared for the worst. I wondered if Tom had got into the hands of the police at last. George could hardly bring himself to speak. You're not going to deny that all my life I've been hardworking, decent, respectable, and straightforward. After a life of industry and thrift, I can look forward to retiring on a small income in the gilt edged securities. I've always done my duty in that state of life in which it has pleased Providence to place me. True? And you can't deny that Tom had been an idle, worthless, dissolute, and dishonorable rogue. If there were any justice, he would be in the workhouse. True? George grew red in his face. A few weeks ago, he became engaged to a woman old enough to be his mother, and now she's died and she's left him everything she had. £500,000, a yacht, a house in London, and a house in the country. John Ramsay bait his clenched fist on the table. It's not fair, I tell you. It's not fair. Damn it, it's not fair. I could not help it. I burst into a shout of laughter as I looked at George's wrathful face. I rolled in my chair. I nearly fell to the floor. George never forgave me. But Tom often asked me to excellent dinners in his charming house in Mayfair, and if he occasionally borrows a trifle from me, that's merely from a force of habit. It's never more than a sovereign.